The document is 1 page long, 14 points, roughly 400 words. It is being typed, corrected, argued over, and retyped by 6 men in a room that the world does not know the location of. When it is finished, if it is finished, it will be handed to 2 governments that have been actively trying to destroy each other for 67 days. And both of those governments will be asked to sign it. Neither one wants to. That is not a contradiction. That is the architecture of the moment. Right now, not yesterday, not in a press release, not in a leaked draft that circulated for weeks before becoming official. Right now, the United States and Iran are within 48 hours of either ending a war or resuming one at a scale that every financial model, every energy analyst, and every military planner in the world has already assessed as catastrophic. The document sitting between them is not a peace treaty. It is not a ceasefire agreement. It is not a diplomatic communique or a joint statement or a framework or a roadmap. It is a 14-point memorandum of understanding, 1 page. And the 14 points on that page represent the most precise and dangerous negotiating terrain that 2 nuclear-adjacent powers have occupied simultaneously since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here is what nobody is explaining clearly enough. The document does not end the war. It creates the conditions under which the war can be paused long enough for both sides to decide if they want it to end. That distinction is not semantic, it is structural. And the structure of the document, what it promises, what it withholds, what it makes contingent on what, is the reason both governments are afraid of it. Not afraid to sign it in the way that negotiators are always cautious before a historic agreement. Afraid in the specific calculable sense that signing this document commits each side to actions that, if the other side fails to perform, give the failing side a legal and diplomatic justification to resume a war that has already cost the global economy somewhere between $800 billion and $1.2 trillion, depending on whose estimate you use. The document is a mutual bet, and the stakes are not abstract. Brent crude oil is trading at $114 a barrel as of this morning. It was $68 on February 27th, the day before the war. That is a 68% increase in 67 days. The International Energy Agency, the body that has tracked global energy markets since the 1973 oil shock, has called the current Strait of Hormuz disruption the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest of the decade, not the largest since the Gulf War, the largest in the history of the global oil market. The IEA has been tracking oil markets for 53 years. That statement is not rhetorical emphasis. It is a technical assessment from the most credible energy monitoring institution on earth. And the document sitting on the table in that room is the only mechanism that stops the next phase. Let me take you through exactly what is on that page, because the gap between what has been reported and what the document actually contains is where the real story lives. And the real story is not about diplomacy. It is about leverage, about which side has more to lose in the next 30 days, about whether a 14-point framework can hold together long enough for 2 governments that fundamentally distrust each other to dismantle the military and economic infrastructure each has built specifically to destroy the other. The document has 5 structural pillars, not 14 separate demands, 5 architecturally distinct commitments, each subdivided into specific verifiable actions, each dependent on the other pillars remaining intact. The first pillar is the nuclear moratorium. Iran commits to an immediate halt to all uranium enrichment, not a reduction, not a pause pending inspection, a halt. The duration of the moratorium is the detail that is still being negotiated in that room right now. 3 sources with direct knowledge of the talks have told journalists that the floor is 12 years. One source has said 15 is the likely landing point. The gap between 12 and 15 is not 3 years of calendar time. It is 3 years of Iranian domestic political survival. The government that signs a 15-year nuclear moratorium is a government that has told its own population it will not pursue nuclear capability for longer than the career of a sitting politician. That is not a technical constraint. That is an existential political commitment inside a country that has used the nuclear program as a symbol of national sovereignty and resistance for 3 decades. The second pillar is the uranium removal clause. This is the detail that has received the least coverage and carries the most structural weight. Iran would agree to remove its stockpile of highly enriched uranium from the country, not store it under enhanced inspection, not dilute it below weapons grade threshold, remove it. The current discussion includes an option that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. The highly enriched uranium would be transferred to the United States, to American soil, under American custody. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is Iran surrendering the physical material of its most advanced nuclear capability to the country it has been at war with for 67 days. The negotiations over who retains custody of that material, under what conditions it can be returned, and what triggers would allow Iran to reclaim it, that negotiation is happening in the same room as the rest of the document, and it has not been resolved. The third pillar is the Hormuz reopening sequence. Both the Iranian shipping restriction and the American counter-blockade, what analysts have been calling the dual blockade, would be gradually lifted over a 30-day period, beginning on the day the document is signed. The word gradually is doing significant structural work in that sentence. It does not mean simultaneously. It does not mean proportionally. The sequence of who lifts what and when is the operational mechanism through which each side verifies the other's compliance before exposing itself further. The United States wants Iran to reduce restrictions on commercial shipping before American naval forces pull back from Iranian port approaches. Iran wants American naval forces to reduce their positioning before Iran reduces Hormuz restrictions. The document must specify the sequence precisely enough to be verifiable, but flexibly enough to survive the inevitable friction of implementation. That is not a diplomatic problem. That is an engineering problem. The fourth pillar is sanctions relief and frozen funds. The United States commits to a graduated lifting of economic sanctions imposed on Iran and the release of billions of dollars in Iranian funds currently frozen in international financial systems. The precise figure of frozen funds being discussed has not been publicly confirmed, but the framework involves staged releases tied to verified Iranian compliance with the nuclear moratorium and the enrichment halt. Each stage of sanctions relief is contingent on verification from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Each release of frozen funds is contingent on Iran's continued compliance with the inspections regime. The sanctions architecture that has been built over multiple administrations across 2 decades does not disappear with a signature. It becomes conditional, and conditional architecture is architecture that can collapse. The fifth pillar is the inspections regime. Iran commits to enhanced IAEA inspections, including SNAP inspections, unannounced visits by UN inspectors to any nuclear facility with no advance notice. This is not the inspections regime that existed under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The JCPOA gave Iran 24 days advance notice before certain inspections. The current document is discussing a regime with 0 advance notice for any facility at any time. That is the inspections architecture that Iran's hardline factions have called an unacceptable violation of national sovereignty for the entirety of the nuclear negotiations that preceded this war. The fact that it is on the table now is a direct consequence of 67 days of military confrontation, economic siege, and the assassination of Ali Khamenei. The hardliners who called it unacceptable are now governing a country whose supreme leader was killed by American and Israeli airstrikes. The political calculus has changed. Whether it has changed enough to accept SNAP inspections is the question that the Iranian delegation is answering right now. But here is the detail that changes the entire architecture of this document, the detail that every analysis has mentioned and none has examined closely enough. The document is contingent, not partially contingent, not contingent on one or two provisions. The Memorandum of Understanding explicitly states that the terms laid out within it, the moratorium, the removals, the Hormuz reopening, the sanctions relief, the inspections, are contingent on a final comprehensive agreement being reached within the 30-day negotiation period that the document initiates. If those 30-day negotiations collapse, the document does not simply expire. It creates a situation in which the United States has begun reversing sanctions relief and releasing frozen funds based on Iranian commitments that Iran is no longer honoring. And it creates a situation in which Iran has accepted SNAP inspections and begun removing enriched uranium based on economic relief that has stopped flowing. The collapse scenario is not a return to the status quo before the document was signed. The collapse scenario is a war that resumes with both sides having exposed their most sensitive commitments to the other side during the 30-day window. A war with better intelligence on both sides about where each side's actual red lines are. A war that begins with the United States able to restore the full naval blockade immediately, language that is explicitly in the document, and with Iran having provided IAEA inspectors access to facilities it would prefer remain unobserved. This is not a peace framework that fails quietly. This is a framework that, if it collapses, fails loudly, expensively, and with consequences that neither side is fully priced. The document is a loaded mechanism. Now, who is actually in that room? The names in the public reporting are Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner on the American side. Neither man is a career diplomat. Neither man has managed a negotiation at this level of technical complexity before. Witkoff is a real estate developer whom Trump appointed as his special envoy to the Middle East, a region whose political architecture he had no documented expertise in before the appointment. Kushner is the president's son-in-law, a former real estate developer who negotiated the Abraham Accords under the previous Trump administration. These are the two men who are right now translating the most technically complex arms control and energy infrastructure document in recent American history into language that both the White House and a fractured Iranian government can accept. That sentence deserves to sit in the room for a moment. Pakistan is the mediating country. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has positioned himself as the broker. A Pakistani source with direct knowledge of the talks told Reuters today, not yesterday, today, quote, "We will close this very soon. We are getting close." That statement is the most direct confirmation from a mediation party that the document is approaching completion. It is also a statement from a government that has its own strategic interest in a resolution. Pakistan shares a border with Iran, relies on Gulf energy routes for its own economy, and has been managing the diplomatic cost of hosting negotiations between two nuclear-adjacent powers while its own domestic stability remains fragile. The geography of this negotiation is not incidental. Pakistan mediating between the United States and Iran is not a neutral hosting arrangement. It is a statement about which countries still have enough standing with both parties to occupy the same room. The list of countries with that standing has shortened considerably since February 28th. And here is the variable that Axios, the outlet that broke the full detail of the 14-point structure this morning, identified as the most consequential unknown in the negotiation. The White House believes Iran's leadership is divided. Not uncertain about the terms, divided, internally fractured between factions that assess the document differently, that have different calculations about what Iran can accept and remain politically coherent, and that are communicating those calculations upward to a government that is itself in the process of reconstituting after the assassination of its supreme leader. Khamenei's son has been appointed as successor. The Islamic Republic has never transitioned supreme leadership before, except at Khomeini's death in 1989. The institutional memory of that transition, the political machinery that managed it, the clerical consensus that legitimized it, all of that was built over decades, and it produced a stable succession. This transition is happening under military attack, economic siege, and with a document on the table that requires the new leadership to make commitments that the old leadership spent decades refusing to make. The man who would have said no to this document is dead. The man who must say yes to it is 44 days into the most difficult political inheritance in the history of the Islamic Republic. Let me show you what happens in each direction. If the document is signed in the next 48 hours, here is the immediate mechanical sequence. The war formally ends. Not the tensions, not the strategic competition, not the fundamental incompatibility of American and Iranian interests in the Middle East. The war. The active military confrontation that has blocked 20% of global oil supply, stranded 20,000 sailors on 2,000 vessels in the world's most important maritime corridor, destroyed major components of the Qatar LNG facility that will take up to 5 years to repair, and triggered the largest emergency release from strategic petroleum reserves in the history of the International Energy Agency. The Strait of Hormuz begins a staged reopening. Tankers that have been anchored on both sides of the strait begin moving. The shipping insurance premiums that have made commercial transit economically non-viable begin falling. Energy markets price the reopening, and Brent crude begins a correction from its current elevated level. Not to pre-war levels, because the infrastructure damage is real and takes months to repair, but away from the ceiling that analysts have been pricing as the floor if the strait remains closed through the summer. The 30-day negotiation clock starts, and the world watches whether two governments that have been shooting at each other for 67 days can sit across a table in Islamabad or Geneva for 30 days and produce a comprehensive agreement detailed enough to be verified, constrained enough to be enforced, and politically survivable enough for both governments to present to their own populations as something other than surrender. That is the optimistic scenario. That is what happens if both signatures appear on one page. If the document is not signed, if the Iranian delegation's response in the next 48 hours is a rejection, a counter-proposal that the American side cannot accept, or a silence that constitutes a de facto no, the structural question is, what comes next? Trump answered that question this morning on Truth Social. He said that if Iran does not allow Hormuz to be open to all, bombing will start at a much higher level and more intense than before. He said this while the negotiations were ongoing. He said this while Witkoff and Kushner were in the room with the document. He said this while Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif was telling Reuters that they were getting close. The threat and the negotiation are not separate tracks. They are the same track. Trump's model for this negotiation, the model he has applied consistently since the war began, is what his team describes as maximum pressure with an open door. Maximum military and economic pressure applied to the point where the cost of continued resistance exceeds the cost of agreement, while maintaining a visible diplomatic off-ramp that allows the other side to exit without being required to perform a complete and humiliating capitulation. The theory is that the pressure is what creates the conditions for the document. The document is what justifies the pressure. The theory has a structural vulnerability. Maximum pressure requires the pressured party to believe that the pressure will actually be applied. And the pressured party, Iran, has been watching Trump pause the Project Freedom naval operation, announce it, pause it again, threaten higher bombing, and simultaneously send Kushner to a negotiating room. The signal discipline required for maximum pressure to function as a coercive mechanism requires that the target believe the threat is credible. When the threat and the negotiation are being communicated simultaneously by the same president, the credibility of each undermines the other. Iran knows the document is on the table. Iran knows Trump wants a deal. Iran knows that Trump's Beijing trip, already delayed once from April while the war raged, is scheduled for next week. Arriving in Beijing with the Iran war unresolved or actively re-escalating puts Trump in what one CNN analyst described as a weakened position for talks with Xi Jinping. China has publicly called for the reopening of Hormuz. China is the world's largest buyer of Gulf crude, and the closed Strait has been a direct cost to the Chinese economy every day since March 4th. The negotiation is not bilateral. It never was. Warren Buffett has not commented directly on the 14-point document. But in assessing the broader dynamics of the U.S.-Iran confrontation, he offered an observation that maps onto the current structure with precision that goes beyond coincidence. He said, "In any negotiation where one side needs a deal and the other side knows it, the side that needs the deal will pay more than the deal is worth. The question the document does not answer is which side needs the deal more. The United States needs Hormuz open. Its economy has been absorbing the energy shock that began on March 4th. And while the shock has been partially cushioned by strategic reserve releases, by Saudi and UAE pipeline rerouting, by demand destruction at the consumer level, the cushion is running out." J.P. Morgan's most recent assessment warned that global oil inventory levels are approaching minimum operational thresholds. The United States is the world's largest economy, and the world's largest economy is approaching the point at which the energy infrastructure that supports it begins to show stress fractures. Iran needs the sanctions lifted. Its economy has been under the combined weight of existing sanctions and the new military confrontation since February 28th. The rial has hit new lows this week. Minimum wages have fallen below $90 in dollar terms. Citizens are reporting layoffs, unpaid wages, food shortages. The humanitarian pressure on the Iranian population is not a negotiating tool. It is a real condition that has a real timeline. Governments under sufficient economic pressure do not negotiate rationally. They either capitulate or they lash out. Neither outcome serves the document. Both sides need this deal. That is not a reason for optimism. That is precisely the condition under which deals that both sides need fall apart. Because when both sides need a deal, both sides believe that the other side's need is greater than their own. Both sides believe they can extract one more concession before signing. Both sides believe the 48-hour window is more elastic than it actually is. The document is 1 page long. It has been almost complete for 3 days. It has not been signed. Here is what the market is doing while the negotiation continues. Stock index futures extended gains this morning after the Axios report detailed the 14-point structure. Oil prices fell on the same news, a mechanical response to the possibility that the Strait might reopen. Treasury yields moved in the patterns associated with de-escalation risk premium unwinding. The market is pricing a deal. The market has been wrong before. The market priced a quick resolution in early March when Trump posted on social media that the Strait had reopened. It had not. The market priced de-escalation after the April 7th ceasefire announcement, and then watched the dual blockade architecture emerge and oil prices climb again. The market's optimism is not a reliable indicator of outcome. It is a reliable indicator of what the market wants to happen. What the market wants to happen and what the 14-point document can survive are two different things. An analyst at Sparta, Singapore, told reporters that even if Washington and Tehran reach a deal today, oil prices will remain elevated for some time because the deal opens the door. It does not clear the mines that Iran has laid in the Strait. It does not repair the Qatar LNG facility that took missile damage. It does not reassemble the insurance infrastructure that has made commercial tanker transit economically non-viable. It does not recrew the vessels whose sailors have been stranded for weeks. It does not immediately restore the 3,000 ships per month that transited Hormuz before February 28th. The document is not a light switch. It is the first step in a disassembly process that takes months, requires verified compliance from both sides at every stage, and can be reversed at any point by either party if the comprehensive 30-day negotiations fail to produce an agreement. The war took 67 days to create this architecture. The document gives 30 days to dismantle it. And now the question that nobody in the rooms where this document is being written can fully answer: if Iran signs, if the uranium is removed, if the moratorium begins, if the inspections regime activates, what does Iran become in the regional architecture that follows? For 3 decades, the nuclear program was not merely a military capability. It was a symbol, a proof of technological independence, a demonstration to Iran's own population and to the region that the Islamic Republic could not be coerced into abandonment by American pressure. The entire political architecture of the resistance economy, the system by which Iran built domestic alternatives to Western goods and financial systems in response to sanctions, was predicated on the idea that Iran would not give the nuclear program away regardless of cost. The document asks Iran to give it away, not symbolically, physically. Remove the enriched uranium, accept the SNAP inspections, halt the enrichment for 15 years in exchange for sanctions relief and frozen funds released over a staged timeline contingent on continued compliance. The question is not whether the Iranian delegation can accept those terms in that room. They appear to be close to doing so. The question is whether the government that accepts those terms can survive politically in Tehran long enough to implement them. And that question is the one that both Witkoff and Kushner cannot answer, because it is not a question about the document. It is a question about the internal politics of a government that is 44 days into an unprecedented succession, governing a traumatized population, facing an economy in collapse, and being asked to sign away the one capability that its entire political identity was built on refusing to sign away. The document is 1 page. The political architecture it requires to function is not 1 page. It is the reconstruction of a domestic political consensus in a country that just lost its supreme leader to a foreign airstrike. That reconstruction may or may not be possible in 48 hours. Here is what to watch in the next 2 days. If Iran's response is affirmative, if the delegation communicates acceptance of the 14 points or acceptance with minor modifications that the American side can accommodate, the signing sequence will be managed carefully to allow both governments to present the outcome to their domestic audiences as a strategic achievement rather than a surrender. The framing will be different for each audience. Trump will say he ended a war and secured the nuclear commitment that no previous president achieved. The Iranian government will say it preserved the Islamic Republic, protected the economy, and extracted sanctions relief from a maximum pressure campaign. Neither framing will be entirely accurate. Both will be politically necessary. If Iran's response is a rejection, or if the 48-hour window passes without a clear response, the White House will face a decision that the document itself anticipated. Resume the naval blockade at full intensity, prepare for the higher-level bombing campaign that Trump described on Truth Social, or extend the window and accept that the extension itself becomes a signal that American patience has limits that Iran can test. Each path has a cost that the market has already begun to price. And here is the unresolved question that the 14 points cannot answer, that no memorandum of understanding can resolve, that will remain open regardless of what happens in the next 48 hours. If this document is signed and the 30-day negotiations succeed and a comprehensive agreement emerges, an agreement that removes Iran's enriched uranium, limits its nuclear program for 15 years, reopens Hormuz, and lifts American sanctions. The country that emerges from that agreement is an Iran that has accepted every constraint it spent 3 decades refusing to accept. Under economic duress, under military defeat, with a new supreme leader whose legitimacy has not been fully established. That is not a stable foundation for a 15-year commitment, and the American side knows it. The document's architects understand that what they are constructing is not a durable peace. It is a structured pause, a mechanism for creating enough breathing room that both governments can step back from active warfare and allow the other dynamics, the economic, the domestic political, the regional, to evolve in ways that the document cannot control and cannot predict. A structured pause is not nothing. In a world where the alternative is resumed warfare at a higher intensity, with oil at $150 a barrel, and J.P. Morgan's inventory warnings translating into actual shortages, a structured pause has enormous value. But a structured pause is not a peace. It is a different kind of war. A war conducted through verification schedules and compliance timelines and 30-day negotiation windows, and the specific language of contingency clauses in a 14-point document that nobody outside of 6 people in an undisclosed location has fully read. The most dangerous wars are not the ones that end with a bang. They are the ones that end with a document, and the document is 1 page long. Whether it gets signed in the next 48 hours, and what it becomes in the 30 days after, and whether the structure it creates can hold for 15 years, those are 3 separate questions, each one harder than the last. The page is ready, the signatures are not, and the oil is still at $114.